Welcome back to the Cloud Hacking series. This episode, we're actually going to take a look at vulnerabilities that happen on the cloud's environments and take a look at how they work, how to exploit them, and how to leverage them when it comes down to hacking within a cloud infrastructure. So let's bring on Carlos, our guest again, and roll the clip. So in our last episode, we talked about what these vulnerabilities are. We talked about server-side vulnerabilities. We talked about dependency confusions and tokens being leaked and that kind of stuff. And we kind of set the mood to what the outcome is, but I feel like it's only just if we do some live demos. And I know you have some, I can see on your screen what you have, but before we look at them, can you tell me what we're gonna take a look at? What are the demos? What vulnerabilities we're gonna, kind of take a look at?
Definitely. I guess that when you talk about cloud vulnerabilities, the first vulnerability that comes to mind is SSFRF, which is server-side request forgery. This is a vulnerability where you can make some server-side components of a web page or something that a user can access, make an HTTP request, a web request to a random page. So because in most used clouds, you have these metadata endpoints. This metadata endpoint is an endpoint storing information about the account that spin up the virtual machine. Because that you can use the SSRF to access the metadata endpoint and access information. This is very, very useful to know where you are, what have you compromised, or even try to identify the company you have just compromised, because in some cases you will just find the SSRF, but you won't even know who this belongs. So it's very useful for identifying, but also in some cases like AWS, GCP, Azure, it might be bad configured and you could even access credentials. So you will be having some kind of privileged access inside the account, inside the cloud account, and that's going to be great because you could start compromising the cloud environment from the inside. Yeah. And that's the first demo we are going to be seeing. The second one that I have prepared is about federation. It's something that a lot of people doesn't take into account. We're preparing some authentication between platforms. In this case, we are going to be compromising AWS from GitHub just because we follow some standard procedure to give GitHub access over AWS. This is the default thing that is going to appear when you follow the steps to give GitHub access, and it's going to just open your AWS account to the whole internet, to the whole GitHub. So that's the second demo I have prepared.
For people that are watching and are not familiar with SSRF, SSRF is a server-side request forgery that pretty much gives you access to an internal network that either you can talk to other microservices or micro apps that are in that network, or in some cases, if they're on a cloud service provider like AWS or GCP, they can hit that metadata IP that's pretty much the same IP address for all these different service providers, and they all provide similar information, and you can pull credentials, and depending on how those credentials are gated, you may be able to leverage your access and kind of lateral movement towards AWS. Cool, let's jump in and let's see what this first vulnerability is like.
Cool. So in this first demo, I didn't set it up because I already know about this public open lab that everyone can be using. This is actually the level 5 of this CTF, and this level 5 will be vulnerable to SSRF. But for anyone at home that wants to learn more about how to attack AWS, and in this case, how to learn more about bucket security, these flows challenges, I think there are two. It's a great way to start. That's the way I started learning about these kind of vulnerabilities. So here you can check some description, and actually you will have some hints about how to continue with this challenge. So if we take a look to these hints, we can see that, hey, there is some path called proxy, and then you can put a domain, and I have already opened it. And what this is going to be doing is to proxyfying your request via SSRF. So there is something inside the infrastructure that is going to be sending an HTTP request to the domain you put here and to the path you indicate, and it will just show you the response. This is just the SSRF you just explained, and it's amazing because there are different types of SSRF. There are one type called blind SSRF where you won't be able to see anything, and it's pretty bad if you cannot manage to improve the visibility of the risk. In this case, we have a full view SSRF. and we are going to be able to see the metadata endpoint you talk about. So as you said, in GCP, AWS, this metadata endpoint is always going to have this IP address, which is 169.254, and again 169.2.54. And the first thing you are going to be seeing is this list of potential paths you can access.
Yeah.
So you can access all these, but the interesting information is always going to be in latest, as his name says.
So before we jump to the latest, I want to kind of show something here, if you don't mind. So people that are watching, to make it more sense, even though you see this in your browser that's showing it to you as your client, the request is being sent on the server side. That's why it's called a server-side request forgery. So if you're watching this, even though this is in your browser, the content of this is being made through the server itself and not your IP address. So you have to verify, if you're looking for SSFRF, you have to verify and make sure the request is coming from a remote IP and not your local IP, and that's when you have the vulnerability. And this one wouldn't work unless it is being made server-side.
Exactly. That's why we can access the metadata endpoint, in this case via the IP address. So you will have some indication, and there is very, very good documentation of AWS about metadata endpoints. I'm going to just show a few of the best way to have interesting information from this metadata endpoint. So here we would go to latest, as I told you. Most of the information is going to be in metadata, but there is this path called user data that, if you don't know about, is where the system administrator is going to be putting some bash commands to be executed every time you spin a new EC2 instance. And what happens when these things happen is that the sysadmin is going to try to be configuring automatically stuff, and to configure automatically stuff, they usually hard-code credentials. So every time you have access to any kind of metadata in GCP, in AWS, you should take a look to user data, because, well, you might find other credentials not even related to the cloud. Yeah. So it's a good point of sensitive information. But definitely, this is a question I would like to ask you, Ben, because this is something that not a lot of persons know. How many AWS credentials do you think you can access from this metadata endpoint?
At least two.
At least two, so you know the second one.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm learning the hard way.
That's cool, because not a lot of people know that there is a second way to get them. So, as you for sure know, the most common way to exfiltrate credentials is to accessing this path right here, latest, metadata, IAM, security credentials, AWS. And here we have some, long tokens. This is actually something you can use to access AWS, and something that we are actually going to be using right now. So let me configure these credentials and show a demo about how can we use them. So if we go to my path, users, Carlos, AWS, we can check.
So you already have installed the AWS CLI, right?
Yeah.
So for this to work, you have to install the CLI. It's really easy, but you have to have it installed for it to work.
Yeah, exactly. And then we are going to be configuring using the credentials we just leaked. We are going to be copy pasting. This is something very important to know. If you do using the CLI AWS configure, it is only going to be asking you for access key ID and access secret access key, but not the session token. Which is the long path here, and if you don't configure
that's
the
the most important part, I feel like.
Exactly.
The first time I actually found this SSRF, I didn't know this. So for a good hour, I couldn't get the credentials work. And then I realized I have 3 lines, and I only have 2 in my config.
Exactly. And that's because AWS configure doesn't tell you, hey, do you have any token?
And that expires, so if they're taking too long, that expires, right? You have to refresh it, okay.
Exactly, but you can exploit again the SSRF and you will get it. Let me call this flaws CTF, the profile.
Okay. And in the URL at the top it shows flaws. So this path always stays the same, except the micro app, whatever internally it's called, goes here. So what people usually do is, if I can really quick, you go to this part, you can go path by path, and it gives you the information you need. So this may change. So if you're looking at this, don't copy this and put in flaws. It's not going to work. You have to go, path folder by folder until you find the application name. But
exactly, this is the name of the role that is using, and it might change. Said. Okay, so now that we have configured credentials, it's called like this. Okay. We can just do a quick AWS profile.
So if we're authenticated, it should work, and then if it doesn't, it's going to tell us no.
Yeah, exactly. STS get caller identity. This is like the who am I of AWS.
And AWS has really good docs on this, so if you're watching this and you want to know how we know all this stuff, I'm surprised you have these memorized. I still have to look them up. I type in how do I profile AWS, so you gotta look them up. Okay, so we do this.
We do this, and if this works and I manage to connect to internet.
Cool, so the account ID is there. I see it. Hopefully people on the video don't get to see this much, but okay, it's there.
Yeah, actually they can see it because it belongs to this CTF, so it doesn't belong to me. So no, actually this is public, so everyone can take a look.
So this shows that we authenticated using those credentials to this flaws user identity, whatever you want to call it. This role, we're connected to it now.
Exactly. And actually the way to get the flag in this step is something I just have written here because it have a very weird ID. Yeah, just here. So in this case, this credential have this access to read some buckets. So with this command, we are going to be listing this bucket with this very, very weird name. That's why we are using S3LS inside the AWS CLI. So if this works, we should be able to take a look to the inside. In this case, we have, this index HTML that we could, for example, download it and take a look. So if we copy.
So you're using pretty much AWS CLI. You already found the bucket name. You can. I think there's a command for it. You can do like AWS S3LS, and it gives you a list of all the different S3 buckets you have access to. But to make it sure, we skip that kind of. And here you're connecting to it. It gives you the folder name that you want, and you're querying for the folder, and you're copying the index file to your machine.
Yeah. Okay. This will be the way to copy. Well, you can also sync. There are other commands to use, but this is probably the simplest one to show. And we just have downloaded, and now if we just cut it, we can see that we just download the flaws HTML that we have in that directory. So this will be a way to exploit the credentials we just found. But for example, something that people might be asking is, okay, I have exfiltrated these credentials. How can I know that I have these permissions? And there are two ways. In the flaws CTF, I think that the way was that somehow you are going to be discovering that there is a new bucket with this name. And the first thing you are going to say is, I have credentials, I have the name of a bucket. Let's see if I can list it. From a red team perspective, what you will try to use is to list IAM roles and policies and see if you can check this information. But usually you won't be able. So there are these other tools that are just brute forcing permissions.
Scout 2, I think there's
for example,
Scout 2 is a really good one.
One of them. There is also another one called Weir AAL that is just going to get hundreds of permissions and say, can it do this? Can it do this? Can I do this? Can I do this?
And the other, I mean, if you're doing the CTF and you want to learn it, honestly, the best way is to learn like how these different AWS CLI functions work, and then jump into it and try to do it manually. Do I have S3 bucket access? Do I have access to EC2 and that kind of stuff? Okay, very cool. So, and people that are watching this and they wonder like, how is that a breach, or how does that work in a scenario when you have access to this? People store their keys on S3 sometimes that's supposed to be internally used, or backups are on there. So one of the companies I own through exactly SSFRF, they had all of their backups on an S3 bucket, and they asked me, the company came back and was like, hey, what's the impact of this? And I was like, just run this command, and it just dumped all their users' backups. So if you're watching this and you go, how is that a vulnerability? Because you can list a bucket. In this example, there's not much of a PII or sensitive data, but this is where people store their data, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, there is a very fun blog post for a couple of years ago where they actually use these S3 permissions to create ransomware. Because you know that S3 can be encrypted with KMS, so you can encrypt it, delete the keys, and no one is going to be able to recover it. So it's kind of a way to do this ransomware. But previously, I asked you how many ways to exfiltrate credentials.
Yeah, there's a second one. Yeah, okay.
So there is a second one, and it's just in a different path. So actually, you need to follow the same path as before. You just start identifying different places to put to access, and at some point, and I think this is fixed. This is a fixed name.
This one is fixed. Yeah. And honestly, I mean, even if it's not fixed, if they go to metadata, it shows you if you have. Because sometimes you may not have access to any of the credentials, right? Yeah. You may have access to the other one, or vice versa. So always go to metadata first and see which ones you have access to. Sometimes it could be both. Sometimes it could be one, and then just go path by path so you don't mistype something.
Exactly.
Okay.
And one last thing I want to show is, in case you manage to get RC instead of an SSRF, you can just copy paste this syntax, this script from Hacktricks, and it will just dump for you all the sensitive information. I thought that it could be interesting to be getting from a metadata.
Oh, so this has all of them. It does them for you.
Yeah.
Nice,
You just copy paste, and it will give you a kind of report with all this information.
And we'll put that in the description of the video to make it easier, or people can just look up Hacktricks and it will take them to the site. We'll put it in the video also. It makes your life easier to do that. So you can just give it the URL and it just brute forces and tells you what you have access to. Nice, okay, very cool. So when we talked earlier, you said, we talked about SSRF, which we kind of talked about already, and I think it's honestly, it's one of the most popular, one of the most fun ones to exploit. It's not always as straightforward, but it makes it really fun. You said you had one more demo. What's the next one?
Let's take a look to this. So it's Federation. Probably people is less aware of these kind of vulnerabilities than SSRF.
Okay.
But let me explain you very fast the structure of this vulnerability, and then we are just going to explore it with a click, because everything is already prepared. So in AWS, you have these identity providers where you can indicate, hey, I want to give access to GitHub Actions. GitHub Actions is the CI/CD way of GitHub to allow you to run code in the cloud whenever something happens in the repo.
Yeah.
So this way you can integrate that code that is going to be run with AWS without needing to hard code AWS credentials in GitHub, which is something you should never do. So the way to do this is you just create an identity provider, you indicate this URL, this domain is actually something that GitHub tells you to put. The audience is always the same one, sts.amazon.aws.com. And then just doing this, you are saying, hey, GitHub, you have access to this, but you need to give GitHub some kind of role, some kind of permissions. So for doing that, what you are going to do is you just create a role, you give some permissions. In this case, we are just giving read-only access to S3. Okay. Very trustable permissions, like nobody is going to put sensitive information here.
Yeah. Well, at least okay.
And then if you will, like, I have already created this, but if you were creating this from the beginning, what is going to happen is going to ask you, hey, do you want to assign this role to a user or maybe to a federated, to an identity provider? And you will say, no, I want this identity provider. You will select it, and this will be automatically created. Okay. This rule real easy. Like you are saying, hey, the principal, this is the user that is allowed to access, is GitHub Actions. This is the way to allow it. This is the identity provider I just showed you before, and I just want to do a check, and I want the audience to be sts.amazonaws.com, just what I show you here. Okay. This sounds legit. This is by default. You just follow the path. This is what you get. If you have this running, anyone in GitHub can access this role. Anyone. Wow. And this happens because you didn't put any other string equal saying I want only to give access to this repository or to this code when these things happen. This is just saying, hey, GitHub, you can just access me. So that's the problem. Okay. The thing is that I have here GitHub Actions just prepared to exploit this. And as you see, the exploit is pretty easy to follow. So let's start from the beginning. We have a name. This means that I can run it manually. These are some permissions you really need to put in order to download the code and to access AWS. Then we are going to be downloading the code. We are going to be configuring AWS credentials. This means that we need to indicate the ARM of the role, which is actually the one we have just here. Mm-hmm. This is the part when we say to GitHub, hey, try to access this role. Then it will configure the AWS credentials as we have seen before. It will put it in the path in AWS credentials. And here we are just going to be calling get caller identity, and we are just going to be listing a bucket to confirm we have the access we promised we have. Yeah. So this is as easy as it gets. We go to actions now. We are going to manually run it. So this is the workflow. Let me run again. And in a couple of seconds, they will spin up a new GitHub action instance. It will be running this code, and we will have the results that I told you, hopefully. So, well, it takes a couple of seconds. So yeah, the main problem is that you could indicate, again, in this condition, string equals, like, I only want to give access to this repository, and that's the correct way to give access only to repository you expect. But if you leave it as default, you only need to know the role ARM to impersonate it and start enumerating everything.
How would I be able to get that credentials? Like, how would I get the user role from a remote attacker?
You mean the ARN?
Yeah.
So you know that GitHub now have a better way to search for regexes in GitHub?
Oh yeah,
That's the way.
They just launched that. That's right. Okay.
Exactly.
So you regex look for that and you leverage that. If whenever it's leaked, you come back and do an action, and then you on the entire role.
Exactly.
Much.
I'm gonna be honest with you. I haven't done this. I haven't attacked other people, but I'm 100% sure there are people doing this wrong, just publishing the ARN, and just because by default it's vulnerable, people could access that.
I mean, AWS itself is so complicated to understand. A lot of people, rely on default configuration, and I know that AWS does a lot of things to protect their users. But at the end of it, people that are watching this, it's on you to make sure things are set up properly, and you are gating things separately. That each role is being gated to just access the thing that it's supposed to access.
Exactly.
Okay.
So just to finish with the demo, here we call the result of get caller identity, which is actually the role we just impersonated.
Yeah.
And this is the results of this bucket where we can see that the folder unsaved is there.
Yeah.
I didn't want to save any sensitive information, so I just
Wow. Okay.
This one.
So anyone could pretty much run this. As long as they have this ARN right here, pretty much, they could run this and get access to the repository.
Yeah, you can just download thousands of these and start running GitHub actions to try to access all the...
So when they're doing this, they're giving the entire GitHub access to that, and if anyone runs an action within their account, they can privest themselves into the organization.
Exactly. That's why cloud is so interesting, because there are a lot of ways to pivot from one platform to the other one.
And it's very complex to understand how these IAM roles also work. Like you misclick one thing, you're kind of screwed. Okay, that was great. So this is something I've never seen actually, which was really, really cool. It's making me want to go to my laptop and see how many bug bounty programs. Because now that I'm thinking about it, I'm going, I don't want to name a company, but like XYZ company that is a bug bounty program. Can I go to CS GitHub, regex for this ARN number, and then just go and run exactly this to see if it gives me access?
And we can go 50-50 in the bounty.
I got you, dude. Cool. All right, so I think this is a really good place for me and you to stop this. We'll have more demos. I think there's like 2 more episodes.
Yeah.
We have more AWS specific things we're going to look at tomorrow. And we're also going to do GCP stuff. So if you're watching this, you're enjoying this content, come back next week. There's going to be more demos, hopefully things that we can also implement from like Web3, or even if you're doing bug bounties, you want to learn from it, we'll talk about more of those. So thank you, man. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, man.
Okay, that's it. That was super cool. I really enjoyed doing that episode with Carlos. I can't wait for you guys to see the next episode where we take a look at AWS specifically, and we kind of play around with some of these AWS labs and how to hack on AWS itself. Cool. See you all next week.